Hello, 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 everyone, and welcome to the Sunday Sermon. I'm Reverend Riff here once again. We're going to talk about some stuff, have some fun, and yeah. Hey, everybody who's here, thanks for being here. I do appreciate it. Thanks for spending a little part of your Sunday morning with me. Hope everybody's had a good weekend so far. I know I have. Did a lot of traveling this week for work, so it's nice to be home and back to my normal routine, as you would say, a little bit. So, don't want to take real long this morning. Just gonna hit you with the good stuff and then let you get back to enjoying your Sunday. As I said, I appreciate you spending any amount of time of it here with me, so I don't want to waste the time that you spend with me. So, you know how this goes and how we start. We always start with the rule of the law. So, in the past few weeks, we've taken our time and really looked at some laws that were, maybe didn't make a whole lot of sense. They seemed odd by our modern standards, or they just seemed a little gross or intense. That's not what we're doing this week. This week, it's a little different. This week, it is simply about something that I thought was funny, just that it was in there. We're talking about biblical building codes. I don't know why this picture struck me as so funny too, but I don't know. The guy's bleeding like something fell and hit him on the head, and he's talking to these other guys, and I don't know. The picture struck me as funny, given that it's biblical building codes, and you're probably saying, "What the hell does building codes have to do with the Bible?" I don't know, but there's a bunch of them in there. We're gonna look at a couple this morning that they make sense actually. It's just funny, and that maybe it shows that the Bible is exactly what many people have said it is. It's a product of its time, and that we shouldn't, read too heavily into certain things because it is a product of its time. Hence the building code info that we've got here. So, let's have some fun with that, shall we? In Deuteronomy 22:8, our old buddy Deuteronomy, it's, the go to. It's when you build a new house, make a parapet around your roof so that you may not bring the guilt of bloodshed on your house if someone falls from the roof. And as you see in the illustration there, got a little parapet around. And yeah, that's literally what they're talking about is have a parapet around your roof. That way if somebody falls off, you're not liable for it. Now, what does that mean? Why is that in there? Well, you have to know a little bit more about the roofs at the time. And see, the houses at the time were very similar to the one that you can see in the picture there. And what that meant was that people spent a lot of time on the roof. The roof was an extension of the house. Again, we're talking pre air conditioning, pre ceiling fans. It was hot in the where they lived. So you spent a lot of time outdoors, especially on the roof in the evenings because you would get a breeze up there. And a lot of times people would even sleep on the roof, especially if you had guests and you needed more space. The roof was generally where you would put them. We've talked a lot in these weeks about the Bible being very specific about taking care of guests. This is another instance of that. If you had guests over, the roof is likely, unless it was raining, was likely where you would invite them to sleep. You don't want your guests rolling off the roof and to their doom down below. If that happened, you were liable because you didn't have a parapet there to keep them from falling off the roof. It's also kind of funny too. It should never be complexion. That's right, Kurt. Parapets on every building. If you don't have a parapet on your building, you are violating the Bible. It is that simple. And I would like to point out that I don't know that I've ever seen a church with a parapet because they're so obsessed with steeples and the angled roof. So literally every church out there is violating this law, I think, which is actually kind of fun when you think about it. But yeah, welcome, Kurt. Thanks for being here. But yeah, so you gotta have a parapet. Parapets, bears. Yeah, don't make fun of bald people. I'm telling you, I'm hipping you to the laws all your Sunday school teachers conveniently left out. So you gotta have a parapet on your building, otherwise you're in trouble. And as we were talking about, that totally makes sense from the standpoint of it's a safety thing. But we also know that the Hebrews are nuts for taking laws literally, and that you've got to have caveats, otherwise, they will take this to its logical extreme. And the idea that you have to put a parapet on every freaking building would be insane. Like, who could handle that? That would take forever. Well, luckily, the Hebrews thought of that, and they added in some freaking zoning codes because the Bible is nothing if not an interesting book here. See, they put in the 4 cubit square rule. So, 1 cubit, that is the length of a man's forearm. How big of a forearm? Men have different sized forearms. Shut up. Stop reading too much into this. Yes, that was the problem with that system. It wasn't a good system, but it was what they had, right? It's generally converted at 17.6 inches. Some people just say 18 or 44.7 centimeters. The 4 cubits rule basically means that about 9 square feet, which is like right at shed size. So basically, you know, ancient Hebrew dad did not have to put a parapet on his man shed as long as he kept it at 9 square feet. That is what the rule says. It's because I guess it makes sense. If it's only 9 square feet, there's probably not people hanging out on that roof. So if they're not hanging out on that roof, they're not in danger of falling off that roof. But yeah, this is one of my favorite ones that we definitely don't observe anymore. You will not see a parapet on just about any building that isn't gigantic and have a flat roof because, all ancient Mideastern buildings tended to have flat roofs. But again, it's one of those, we like to pick and choose what rules we follow. And we want to hammer on the ones that reinforce our bigotry and prejudices. But yet, ones like this, which, if we learned anything from last week's Bible story, is that there's not small rules. There's only big rules. God only deals in big rules. And if you're thinking that there's small rules, like not having a parapet on your building, you're going to get space lasered. That's all I'm saying. So let's move on. We've got other interesting building codes. This one is one of my favorites. This is housing inspection in the Bible. That's right, folks. They had housing inspection. This is talking about what is done whenever a man builds a new house. Well, the priest has to be involved in this. How? On the 7th day, the priest shall return to inspect the house. If the mold has spread onto the walls, he is to order that the contaminated stones be torn out and thrown into an unclean place outside the town. He must have all the inside walls of the house scraped, and the material that is scraped off dumped into an unclean place outside the town. Then they are to take other stones to replace these and take new clay and plaster the house. If the defiling mold reappears in the house after the stones have been torn out and the house has been scraped and plastered, then the priest is to go and examine it. And if the mold is spread in the house, if it is a persistent and defiling mold, the house is unclean. It must be torn down, its stones, timbers, and all the plaster taken out of the town to an unclean place. Yeah, so it's a housing inspection. There is no other way to read that. When you build a new house, the high priest has to come and check it for mold. And if he finds mold, you get one chance to clean that mold up. The second time, they're tearing your house down and throwing it into the garbage dump on the outside of town, which would have been the unclean place. That's also where the people who had leprosy and often prostitutes and whatnot would have hung out because they were also considered unclean. We talked about this a little bit last week. They're really into cleanliness. Yeah, mold. The Bible has a black mold section. Again, I think it's hilarious. And people, it's pretty good that, housing inspection, which I'm sure there is some very hardcore religious guy who lives, I'm going to go out on a limb and say he lives in Mississippi, Alabama, a state like that, and that he thinks it is absolutely a violation of his privacy that the government comes and inspects his home and tells him that he can't, have a meth lab in the basement or whatever. I feel like that guy has probably never seen this verse and really would not like the implication of this verse that, there are authorities bigger than yourself. But also, oh, there are way more than one of that guy. Don't I know it? I was trying to be optimistic, but let's be honest, Kurt. That guy has procreated like a champ somehow. Somehow, there is a whole lot of that guy. But yeah, I mean, this is common sense shit. Don't build a house with moldy stuff. But apparently, what I think is interesting here is you would think that a normal person saying that would be fine. But in the days of hyper, self sufficiency, which is Austin, they're definitely libertarians. The hyper self subsistence that went on back then, you're not just gonna take some guy's word for it. Hey, you get that mold in your house, that's gonna kill you. Yeah, I'll be fine. So what did they have to do? Because as we've talked numerous times, population growth is one of the absolute keys of the Old Testament. Like you can almost think of like the Hebrews as like really fragile babies, and God is giving them all these rules because they're so stupid they'll hurt themselves. And he's like, "No, I need you to grow and there to be more of you, not, fall down and hit your heads and do dumb stuff like build houses filled with mold or have people rolling off your rooftops." So, he had to come up with building codes. And again, I love just how common sense they are. Like, if there's mold in your house, take out the parts that have mold on them. If it starts to grow back again, sorry, you got to start over. Everything's bad. That's common sense. So if you ever have somebody complain about a building inspection, but like it's in the Bible, and then they'll just say that's insane, and they'll be right. But it's in here. So we have building inspections. And finally, this is one of my favorite ones. If anyone uncovers a pit or digs one and fails to cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the one who opened the pit must pay the owner for the loss and take the dead animal in exchange. So, I mean, again, pretty simple on the surface, but this one's got a little more subtext to it, which is why I left it for the end here, because, again, it's interesting. So, this seems common sense. If you dig a well or a pit for whatever reason, I don't know why you're digging pits, it's, 1400 BC, it's none of my business. But if you dig a pit and someone's ox or donkey falls into it, then hey, you got to pay them, and you can keep the dead or broken donkey or ox that fell into your pit. That's not his problem anymore. It's now your problem. Now, when I read this, I was like, again, that just seems like common sense, right? If you dig a pit and you don't cover it and somebody falls into it, you're responsible. But notice that's not what's mentioned here. It doesn't say if someone falls into the pit. It says an ox or donkey. It's being very specific here that this is a property damage thing. Whereas if it was, a person rolling off the roof, you were guilty of their bloodshed. Now, why is that not mentioned here? I looked into some rabbinical texts, and it basically boils down to a dealer's choice kind of situation, if you will. That, let's say, unfortunately, that pit you dug, it's not an ox that falls into it, it's my son, and he dies from falling into your pit. Well, then I get options. Because the law here does not specifically mention that if my kid falls into a pit and dies, I get to kill you, or it mentions that we kill one of your kids. Usually the Bible is very specific about stuff like that. Because that is not mentioned here, the take from rabbis was that basically it's the choice of the aggrieved person. He can say that he wants blood as payment for the loss of his blood, and that has to be worked out. Or he can say that he is willing to take financial remuneration in exchange for the blood, and that he will basically absolve the person of guilt for payment. So they give you a choice here. That is one of the things that I think makes ancient Hebrew law so interesting, is that, as we talked about, I think it was in our very first or second week, that Hebrew law is all based on case study. It is not based on legislation. It is all case study, and you look at the cases, and that tells you what to do. And so oftentimes it's what they put in the cases, but here it's what's specifically left out of the case study that lets you know that there are options here. It's not just, an immediate punishment. The person who lost something by falling in the pit because dumbass didn't cover the pit, that's how you decide who gets what as a form of payment for the aggrieved situation. So, again, don't dig pits. If you do, cover them up when you're done with them. These are all, I don't think that a single one of these biblical rules this morning we really have that big of a problem with. Now, the parapet thing, that's an architectural thing, but you could still put a parapet on shit. You could put a parapet on stuff. So maybe I'll start hounding religious institutions now about why they don't utilize the parapet as commanded by God. So, okay. So that was our fun with the rule of the law. We even worked in some conversion rates for cubits. So start measuring shit in cubits, folks. It'll be great. Maybe I'll start talking about NFL statistics in cubits. Like, he had 75 cubits rushing yesterday or things like that, just to really mess with people. All right. So let's get to the main story here. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. You should write all the fake southern churches about their lack of parapets. They want to hammer on the other parts of that Old Testament. Let's ask them about parapets. Nobody's ready to talk about parapets. I'm hitting them with the hard stuff. Alright. This, I feel like... Oh, I guarantee you Joel Osteen is parapetless. There's no way he's putting a parapet on that building. It might have cost a nickel. So Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. I would say that as far as Old Testament Bible stories go, this one has got to be up there as the most well-known. You would be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't know at least the basic elements of this story. That Jericho had walls, God knocked them down, Israelites win. I feel like that much of the story just about everybody knows. That's the crux. We're going to take it a little bit deeper today. And we're going to do that in two major ways. What we're going to do is we're going to briefly rehash the story itself. We're going to go through, as I call it, the magic edition, which is just straight from the text. What the text says happened, we will talk about that. We will do a brief refresher for anybody who doesn't know all the nitty-gritty on this story. Then we will look at a non-magic alternative. This is what I actually find to be one of the more interesting parts of this story, is that there is a completely non-magical way to make this story make total sense without changing any details. Just looking at maybe some details that weren't in there but are alluded to through art and through the writing, and see if that alternative makes sense to us. Then we're going to look at the historical evidence, because there's some trouble with the timeline on this thing, and it kind of turns out at the end this story is probably more than likely just propaganda, as good of a story it is. Solomon cutting the baby in half. Even though they did not actually cut the baby in half, it was a pretty clever ruse to, flush out the child's real mother. Theoretically, it's one of those. It's a clever ruse because it worked. It's not so clever of a ruse if they actually cut the baby in half. And David creeping on Bathsheba. Yeah, that's it gets to treason at one point, and then what happened with Absalom, his son, right after that, which theoretically was the punishment. All very interesting, and we may have to dive into those. Yeah, I know, Christian propaganda, you're stunned, Kurt. So am I. So let's look at the magic edition of this story. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days, and have seven priests in there. But so the story, Jericho. It's on the north end of the Dead Sea. Powerful city. It's the first real. It did, and I think I'm back. Can you hear me, Kurt? I think I'm back. Hope I'm back. You never know if you're back or not. But yeah, God struck me down. He was not happy. So it's the first real city, real big city that the Hebrews allegedly encounter as they have now entered into Canaan and are wrecking shop across the country. They've taken out a few minor kings on their way to Jericho, and word has gotten to Jericho. Jericho is like, uh-oh, this is bad news. So they lock the walls up. Nobody's going in, nobody's going out. The city is on lockdown. Well, when that happens, God comes to Joshua and says, hey, I'm going to help you get the city. And Joshua goes, I don't have enough guys to, like, storm this city, and I don't have enough supplies. No, it was my end, too. It was my end, too, that made this glitch. So he said, I don't have enough supplies to siege this city. What are we going to do? God's like, don't worry about it. What I want you to do is get everybody in the army together, full regalia. March around the city one time. Do that every day for 6 days. On the seventh day, I want you to march around 7 times and have your guys blow their ram's horns, also known as a shofar, and then give a great shout. And when you guys do that, I will knock the walls down, and you will go in and wreak havoc. And God was very specific about the havoc he wanted wreaked. Everyone died. Every man, every woman, every child, all the livestock had to be killed. Burn it, salt the earth. No one will ever rebuild here is basically the idea, as well as the whole, we're not going to take any wealth from this. We're destroying this city because it's evil and it's in our way, but we're not going to pollute and plunder. That is an important distinction. Yeah, a loving God. Kill the kids. Yep. That is, yeah, that's how they roll, right? So, let's think about this for a minute. So every day for 6 days, the army marches around this city. It's mentioned that the walls of Jericho are incredibly thick. And so the people can stand up on top of the walls and kind of watch this weird procession with the Ark of the Covenant go around the building, go around the walls. And I have to point this out. Oh, it's Crusader God. I have to point this out just because the art history person in me is going crazy right now. This is a painting. There's something incredibly wrong in this painting. What's incredibly wrong in this painting is that you see the Ark of the Covenant is with those 4 men back there carrying it behind the guys with the shofars. Isn't that true? See, the problem is that the Ark of the Covenant was considered so holy that it could never be looked at. Even when it was carried like that, it was underneath a thick purple sheet to cover it up, because if you could even look at it, it would melt your eyeballs out, Raiders of the Lost Ark style. Like, that's probably pretty close to what would actually have happened. So these guys just casually strolling around with an uncovered ark is so inaccurate. And I get that the reason the artist painted it like this is they really wanted you to know that was the ark, and if it was just some guys carrying a purple thing under a drape, your average person might not know. But it bugs me, and we're all about, yeah, hot, steamy, melty action. That is what happens. You are like cheese on the grill. You're a mess. So be careful. Don't look at the ark. So anyway, the Bible tells us that is exactly what happened. The people, Joshua and his crew, did their little march every day. They blasted a trumpet. The walls fell down. They went in and ransacked it, killed everybody just like God told them to, and they put a curse on the land that anybody who tried to rebuild Jericho, his first son would die on the day he started, and his youngest son would die on the day that he finished. And there was a guy named I forget his name. He was a Hephalite. I'm not familiar with them as a people, but he fulfilled the prophecy when hundreds of years later he rebuilt Jericho, and sure enough, when he laid the first brick, his oldest son died, and when he laid the last brick, his youngest son died. Because again, killing children who had nothing to do with the situation is kind of how God rolls. So anyway, that's a great story, right? Well, there's a little bit of interesting part of this story that happens a couple chapters before this that people often remove from the actual battle. That, in my opinion, is a Shamgar level piece of badassery that is actually cooler than the whole idea that they did a very coordinated dance and then when they blew a trumpet, magic knocked the walls down. I think there's something way cooler here. I'm, of course, talking about Rahab. Rahab is described as a prostitute. That may or may not be an accurate assessment of the situation. The Bible described just about every woman who does something cool as a prostitute. Doesn't mean they were. The Hebrew term that they used did literally at the time translate to prostitute woman. But she's also in the story referred to as an innkeeper. And in a certain way of reading it, it could be she is the woman who kept an inn. And that it was not uncommon for an inn to double as a brothel. So she could have been a madam. She could have actually been a woman who worked there. She could have just been an innkeeper who's had her reputation sullied throughout all history as being a prostitute because prostitutes do business at inns, and if she owned an inn, there would have been prostitutes there. It doesn't necessarily mean she had a damn thing to do with the prostitution. We don't know. But she is often referred to as Rahab the harlot. In most art, you will see her referred to as Rahab the harlot, and I think that's kind of bullshit because we don't actually know that. But I digress. So, in the earlier parts of the stories, Joshua sends some spies to get into Jericho. Now, a very interesting part of this story is we've already been told that the city is locked down because they know Joshua's in the area, so nobody's coming or going. So how the spies get into Jericho? That the Bible conveniently neglects that part. All it tells us is that they did get into Jericho. So they got inside of Jericho. They're in there. They're trying to get some intel. But the king has heard that they are coming. So he's on the lookout too. And, again, how they got in, we're not sure, but they got in. They make their way to Rahab. The Bible goes on and on to tell us that Rahab had heard about Joshua and the Israelites and knew that they were going to win. She knew that they were totally going to smack down Jericho, so she decided she wanted to be in with the winning team, and she agrees to help these guys out. Again, the Bible goes out of the way to justify someone betraying their people, a la Jael with Sisera, as long as you're doing it for God. It's propaganda at its highest form. That, none of the social mores or loyalties in your life mean anything if they conflict with God. It's top-notch, top-notch propaganda there. So, Rahab has these two spies in her house. Well, the king's men come because they want to know, they've heard that these guys are in, and somebody says that they saw them hiding with Rahab. Rahab tells them, oh yeah, two guys I didn't know did come here, but I have no idea who they are, and I sent them away because I didn't trust strangers, and I'd heard that there are spies about. They go, hey, thanks for the tip. Meanwhile, what she actually did was took the boys upstairs and literally performed the first ever hide in the haystack move. The Bible talks about she had them hide in flax bundles that she had picked earlier. So, literally the first time that I can find that anybody's pulled that maneuver off. It was tremendous. And so, after that one, the guys tell her, we appreciate you. She goes, look, I'm going to help you get out of the city and back to Joshua, but I need some assurances. I know that you guys annihilate everybody. She said, I know that's your MO. That's what we've heard. And it was. So she said, you got to promise that me and my family don't get slaughtered when you come in and kill everybody. Which, interesting enough, was totally not the deal that God made with Joshua about sparing one family that helped them out. No, never once is that commented on. But these guys tell her, yeah, we'll totally, we'll make sure you don't get killed. They tell her, but what you got to do is you got to put this cord in your window. This scarlet cord. And if you put this cord in your window, we'll know not to kill the people that are in that house. Don't come out of your house when the shit hits the fan, no matter what you hear. And if you don't put that cord in your window, then it's not on us if you get killed. And she goes, okay, cool, I agree. Now, what's with this cord? Well, I'll tell you what I think is with this cord. How did they, if you look at any art, some of the art that I've used today, you can Google Rahab and the spies. Any art you find shows the spies climbing up the walls via this cord. That is never mentioned in the Bible. But always on point with the Scarlet. Absolutely. What I think is more likely is that Rahab helped these spies out by lowering a cord to allow them to climb the wall and get into the city. Then she hid them at her brothel, right? She's an innkeeper, brothel runner, whatever you want to call it. What if what actually happened was the reason they marched around 6 times is every time while they marched around and this distracted everybody in the city, a couple of Joshua's Navy SEAL-like guys snuck in. And so every day a couple more snuck in. A couple more snuck in as they walk around. On the 7th day, the last day that they would have to worry about being detected, so you march around 7 times that day and sneak a few guys in each time. By the time you're done with that, you've gotten a small, well-equipped fighting force. What better place to hide a small group of men in a city but in an inn? And then, boom, trumpet shouts, everybody cheers. That's the signal, and your guys burst out of the inn hiding and kill a few guards, throw open the gate, and the walls come tumbling down. That actually sounds way cooler to me, is way neater, and actually completely logically makes sense. One rifle. One well-placed rifle with a box of ammunition, and this whole story changes. But yeah, I've always thought the cord and Rahab, that there's more there, and that's the real reason we're marching around the building, is that it's creating a sideshow while we're sneaking a few guys in, and that the real reason they couldn't kill Rahab and her family is she's the entire reason they won the battle. Not because they made some side deal, which again, who were these guys to be making side deals on God's behalf? Wet works are always more interesting than magic show farce. Thank you. The fact that they put on this charade and distracted all these people while sneaking in a guerrilla force to throw the walls open, that's awesome. That's some Shamgar level subterfuge there. Why are we not studying that? Instead, we're talking about magic. It's not as interesting to me. Now, that takes us to an important distinction that we do have to make. Did this even fucking happen? That gets a little more dicey. So, the Battle of Jericho allegedly took place, I shit you not, on 4/20/1400. That is when the Jewish calendar states that the Battle of Jericho occurred. That 4/20 would have been the day, because they blew the horn. The city of Jericho however, was likely abandoned after it was mostly destroyed by an earthquake in 1573. Now, I am going to be completely transparent that 173 years, the 420 origin story, that's fucking brilliant. I will be completely honest that 173 years is not a huge gap when you're talking about carbon dating and trying to nail down historical things from almost 4,000 years ago. 173 years is not a huge gap. And if you want to stick with the magic version of the story, an earthquake that knocked the walls down sure does seem like you could, intune it that God knocked the walls down for you, or that God used an earthquake to knock the walls down. All of those are possible. But we have to look a little more at the context. Because, you see, the book of Babylon, the book of Joshua, was written in 550, which is us. Yes, you're right. That's a solid almost 900 years after the events allegedly took place. 900 years is a long time. Also, you look at what was going on. See, it was 598 when Babylon, under King Nebuchadnezzar, invaded Canaan, the land we know as Israel, and took him about 12 years, and it was, I think, 585, 586, he sacked and burned the first temple and took the Hebrews into captivity. About 30 years later is when they write the book of Joshua, because at that point the Babylonian Empire is starting to fall. There's been a couple uprisings, and there's also starting to get the feeling that maybe they're going to be able to go back. And so what do you need to do in that time? You need to legitimize your claim to the land. You've been away from that land for almost 40 years now. You've got the feeling you're going to get to go back. How do you legitimize your claim to it? 900 years is 4 rewatches of the extended Lord of the Rings? Maybe. I don't know if you can fit it in 4 times. 3.5. But, yeah, so you've got to re-legitimize yourself as the people who this land belongs to. And that's tough to do when you haven't been there in 40 years and you never really had complete control over it in the first place. So what do? You tell stories about people from the line of David who, coincidentally, happened to go all the way up to Zerubbabel, who happened to be the guy that eventually in 536, when the Hebrews were released by the Persians and said, yeah, you can go back, we don't care, you'll be a vassal of us. When that happened, he happened to be the guy who was like, hey, look, I'm a descendant of David, so I'm totally in charge, right? And he helped build the second temple. And that's where they went from there. But the propaganda, it just seems to fit too well. That perhaps they found the city of Jericho, could tell that it had been destroyed in some kind of scary fashion, and wrote a little story that makes it sound like their God totally is the one who did that. So don't fuck with them. This land belongs to them. Or maybe they actually did fight the Battle of Jericho and used some amazing special ops to take it over, but somehow decided that wasn't a cool enough story and totally went with we used magic to knock these walls down. Instead of just going with the cool story. So, you ask any historian, they will basically tell you that the book of Joshua is a historical nightmare. None of the dates add up. Everything in it is questionable at best to try to really see if it took place that way. Did it have... It's a nightmare. Again, it was written during exile as a way to legitimize the Hebrew claim to Canaan. That is like the main thing the book of Joshua does, is show that God has their back and that Canaan is theirs. The other important thing that it does is it shows the Hebrews as being separate from the Canaanites. There's constant reiteration of the fact, and then we totally killed everybody. And then we totally killed everybody, men, women, and children. Now, while that also serves to help their brutality, which would make people afraid of them, which might get you to surrender or flee from them instead of challenging them to battle, it also serves a very important ethnic distinction. That's the things folks need to realize. All this got written down to serve a function, report facts. Absolutely, Kurt. That is 100% where I am headed with this. You're on it. Is that this book is not a historical document. This book was propaganda written to legitimize the Hebrews, to say, look, we did not intermarry with any of the Canaanites when we were there the first time. We kicked their asses, we killed them, but we did not breed with them. We are separate. We are a different people. We are God's chosen people. We are not the product of the intermixing of two peoples in a common land. That is not what happened. And also, we are totally not colonial conquerors who went around eradicating, different races and ethnicities from the face of the earth, destroying cultures to the point that we still don't know anything about them. We did all that because God told us to. It was totally cool. It was not a campaign of military aggression and conquest. It was a religious campaign of freedom. That is how they spin it, which, if I need to tell you who else has spun things as religious campaigns of freedom, I need to read your history more. So there is definitely, it's not, I don't know. I've always liked this story. As a kid, I always thought it was really cool. And then as I got older and I've learned more about it and the nonsense and the propaganda and the just general joy and glee at exterminating an entire city full of people, it's less of a fun story. And I don't know how I feel about the existence of it as fact. Whether I hope it happened or not. I feel like, I guess I hope it didn't, because then those people didn't get exterminated by other people. They got exterminated by an earthquake, and I suppose that makes it better. But, it's all not fun. There was a headline about it on Politico. That's fucking gold, Kurt. Oh, man. Well, so, I guess, in summation, just if I could get you to take anything from this today, what I want you to take from this is that, as Kurt said, when you read a story, especially something like this, don't read it from the standpoint of what's the story saying. Read it from the standpoint of what did the person who wrote this story want me to think. Always think about the author and what is the author trying to say, because you will very quickly figure out if the author is trying to tell you a story because they're relaying facts, or if they're trying to tell you a story to manipulate your emotions and get you to feel a certain way. Those are different, and one has a much higher chance of telling you the truth, or at least something closer to the truth. I think one of the most infuriating things for the world and me is the phrase, speak your truth. There is not your truth, there is the truth and your perception of it. But the truth doesn't change. The truth isn't malleable. It's binary. What happened, happened. You can perceive it, interpret it, and look at it any way you want. But at the end of the day, what happened, happened. And what didn't happen, didn't happen. And guys didn't march around a big walled city 13 times and then blow some horns and magically make the walls fall down. Yeah, Vince definitely wrote that book. That is the Vince book of the Bible. It's just complete insanity. But yeah, thanks for being here this week, everybody. Next week, I haven't completely decided what we're gonna do yet. I have some ideas, but again, if anybody has something that they really want me to, talk about, please shoot it in the cord. I would be super interested to hear your thoughts on what you want to see me do. I uh, I enjoy doing these every week, but yeah, if somebody else wants to come up with a subject, I am all about diving into it, researching it, and you want Bathsheba? We could do Bathsheba. You know what? I like it, Kurt. Maybe. Oh, I got an idea for it. We're gonna do a series. I've just decided it right now. We're gonna call it the Flawed Hero series, where each week we're gonna take a look at somebody that was a hero in the Bible that you probably know about their heroic deeds. We're going to take a look at their misdeeds because the Bible, I give you that. It is for every Jesus that you've got, that, Son of God, all powerful, all that, you've got some real flawed heroes. Some guys that definitely did some shit that was uncouth, and the Bible calls them out on it. They're very well-rounded characters because they're not just these inhuman killing machines or these paragons of virtue and wisdom. They fuck up, and they fuck up hard. And so yeah, you know what? I love it, Kurt. We're gonna start next week our Flawed Heroes series. And we are really gonna look into the flaws of these great men because fuck it, it's fun, right? That's what we're here for. We're here to have fun. They can't all be Jesus or Shamgar. And for all we know, Shamgar may have been a douche canoe. He only got one verse. That's, I feel like, the thing in the Bible. The more verses you get, the more odds there are you're going to do something stupid. The more screen time you get, the more likely you are to turn heel at some point. So, thanks everybody for being here. Let's see. Let's go. Why don't we go raid our buddy Lord Baal? Let's go raid him. He's playing God of War, and we love Lord Baal, so let's go raid him. But thank you everybody for being here. I love you to death, and I can't wait to hang out with you next week. And it's gonna be good. So thanks for being here, everybody, and we will see you next week. We're going to go play God of Shamgar.